All right, good evening everyone and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. Tonight we are joined by Chris Blore from Agriculture Victoria on a three-part webinar series. Tonight is part one and Chris is discussing where does a stock containment area fit in a farming system. Just a bit of housekeeping to get us started. This control panel will be at the top right corner of your screen. The red arrow on the left of the control panel collapses and reinstates it. If you want to get a better look at your screen this evening, you should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. As Chris goes through his presentation, please type the questions in the box provided. I will relay them to Chris at the end of the webinar. I will also note these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website, usually by the end of the week. Just a bit about our presenter this evening. Chris grew up in the Central West New South Wales before he graduated with a Bachelor of Farm Management from Charles Sturt University in Orange. Over the next few years, he spent his time in southern Queensland on an 18,000 SCU feedlot, working across all facets of the business. Chris joined the department in 2011 as an extension officer with the Agriculture Victoria Meat and Wool team based in Hamilton, where he has had the opportunity to work on a range of beef and sheep projects. He has had a strong interest in the use of technology in agriculture and its various applications. So we're very lucky to have Chris and the Agriculture Victoria team with us this evening, and we are about to embark on part one of the stock containment area webinar series. So I'll just hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Hilary. Can you see my slides there?
Yep, all good to go. Thanks, Chris.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Yeah, as Hilary said, I'm based in Hamilton, and thank you for coming along this evening. So without too much, I'll get into it. I will state that I am no expert when it comes to this. I just know enough to get myself into trouble and get nominated for a webinar. So if you do have questions, ask them, but some of them I may need to take on notice. And knowing full well that next week and the following week, we've got two others that fit into this program. So you've got myself this evening with where does it fit within your farming system. Next week, we've got Clem, a colleague from Ararat, talking about designing and fit for purpose. And then the following week, we've got Nick Linden from the Northeast talking about nutrition management and risks. So if I don't cover it tonight, they may cover it next week. But if not, yeah, feel free to reach out and we'll take questions on notice. So tonight, I just want to cover what in Victoria, at least, we define a stock containment area as. I know this is a national platform, so I do apologise in advance for some of the businesses and farmers in New South Wales, South Australia, Queensland, Western Australia, wherever else you may be joining from. While this is our definitions, I imagine that they are extremely similar to what your jurisdictions will have. And from the research I've done, when it comes to things like involving the Shire, that is your requirement as well as ours. So then I'll cover a bit around where does it fit within your farm versus in your business. The planning considerations specifically for Victoria, but as I said, that will be similar for New South Wales, South Australia and other jurisdictions. And then a bit on each of the definitions of what we define emergency, seasonal and supplementary feeding. So in Victoria, we define a stock containment area as somewhere to confine, feed and water animals while ensuring that animal maintenance requirements are met and are met in response to an emergency event or other adverse seasonal climatic conditions. So it's definitely not a feedlot or a sacrifice paddock or a laneway, but it's an area that you can use to benefit animal production or land management to prevent pasture loss and other things. It is designed for a discrete period. If there is the intent for you to use it long term, to finish animals, to buy in animals and finish them, that you are probably looking at a feedlot over a stock containment area. So just take that into consideration. And it is an area that you will need to be managing daily. We typically define them as an area of about 2,500 square metres for approximately 500 sheep or about 160 head of cattle, but Clem will go into a bit more detail around that next week. For Victoria, typically you don't need approval for a stock containment area with the Shire, but you do depending on some of your overlays, which we'll get into in a bit more detail shortly. So where does it fit within your farm? I guess the first thing to do is ask yourself, why do you want or need a stock containment area? With one of these sort of decisions, it's always good to use a bit of forward thinking. So it might be worth asking yourself 5 times why you need a stock containment area. So it could be, why do I want one? To put my sheep in. Why do you want to put them in there? To make it easier to feed. Why will it make it easier to feed? Because you won't have to drive around the entire farm. You'll just have to drive to one area. Why do you need to drive all over the farm? Because it's a dry season and the pastures are running out. Why don't you want to be driving all over the farm? Because it's going to destroy the paddocks, and so on and so forth. So by doing that, you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of why you need it. And are you prepared to go through why you need it? Once you've actually decided that you do need it, then we get to the questions of where will it fit within your farm? So do you want it close to the infrastructure of your hay sheds, shearing sheds, silos? Or is it better off in the middle of the farm near some extra yards so that you can quarantine or use it as hospital? Or if you find strays, you've got somewhere to store them until you can get them out. Do you have vehicle access? You need to get in with a feed cart, whether that's behind a tractor or behind a ute, and stock access. There's no point having vehicle access if you can't get the stock in there. Other things to consider is how close do you want it to your house? Do you want to be able to see it from the back veranda and not have visitors for 3 months while you've got sheep in containment? Or, do you want it near the neighbours where they can smell it and you get phone calls every couple of days? Does it need to be away from roads so that people who don't understand farming systems don't drive past and go, oh, those poor sheep, and ring up and complain when nothing's actually wrong? Obviously, waterways is a big issue, making sure you're far enough away. In Victoria, basic rule of thumb is at least 100 metres from a designated waterway, but I'll go into a bit more about that later. And then obviously close to water supply. How are you actually going to supply water to your stock in there? Then you can get into a bit more detail around what stock go in. Is it your breeding stock? Is it your younger stock that you're trying to get up to condition for breeding? Is it the older stock that are harder to keep in condition when they're out in a paddock? Once we've done that, then we can start looking into where does it fit within your business? Again, why do you want an SCA? Why do you want a stock containment area? Is it because you want to reduce your labour costs of driving around the farm? Is it because you don't want to do them? They're the sort of questions you need to ask yourself. Then how do you plan to use it? Is it just for an emergency? So in the event of a fire, flood or drought? Is it a seasonal thing, knowing that seasons are changing, weather patterns are a bit more sporadic? Is that why you intend to use it? Or is it supplementary feeding in the sense of you want to get your ewes up to condition for joining, or maintain condition post joining before scanning, or differentially feed post scanning based on pregnancy status? Once we've sort of worked out a few of those details, then you can look at, is it going to be an intensive system? In that intensive system, I mean by the definitions, particularly here in Victoria, but obviously other states as well have their definitions. And will that trigger you needing a permit? So this is more getting towards that feedlot end of things. And if you're looking at that, a bit of forward planning. Do you think it's worth getting a permit? Is your operation big enough that you may trigger some overlays, and it might be worth getting a permit now so that in the future you have room to move? You can capitalise it and use it as a feedlot down the track. If not, that's fine. Just do it as a stock containment area. But either way, take the time to sit down and write out a stock containment area plan. The who, the what, the why, the when, the how. So who's going to do it? Who's actually going to feed? Who's going to put the stock in? Who's going to look after them? What stock are going to go in? What are you going to feed them? When are you going to feed them? How often? How much? Where are you going to do this? Why are you going to do it? Is it because it's seasonal? What are the trigger points? Is it supplementary? And how? How do you plan on doing it? Do you need to upgrade machinery? Do you have the machinery on hand? Do you have the silos and the storage on hand? I really recommend you do write it down, because it is worth putting down and making sure that you've covered all your bases before you get into this. Because if you're into it and then you go, oh, we need to upgrade our machinery, that may take several months for it to happen and you've missed the opportunity. So I do recommend writing it down early and having a plan. More on the regulations. So in September 2018, new animal industry planning reforms came into effect. What this means is not a great deal of difference. Most of it was already permitted or not permitted, and not a lot has changed. However, what it's actually meant is the benefits for producers is clearer regulation, reduced regulation in some respects, and greater flexibility for grazing-based operations. Not so much of an issue for most of the listeners tonight about pig and poultry farming, but also greater guidance and training for local government to support them in understanding and determining whether the applications were sufficient. If they weren't sufficient, what extra information did the council require to make a decision? So on that, we basically ended up getting two definitions. We have grazing animal production, which the vast majority of producers fit into, and it's land that's used for animal production where animal food is obtained by directly grazing, browsing or foraging plants that grow on the ground. Basically, they eat what's in the paddock. Versus an intensive system where you provide it for them. So in this situation, that's a feedlot. That might be in a dairy system, for an example, might be a feed barn, or so on and so forth. What the difference here means is whether or not you need permits, whether or not you need to talk to council early. So understanding the difference is important, and we actually have in Victoria a panel that you can reach out to help you make some of these decisions and help you work through council if you need to. So just to give you a bit of an indication, this is what they call a nesting diagram. So for this situation, you can see that we've got agriculture, animal husbandry, animal production, and then we break down into intensive animal production, such as cattle feedlots and intensive, or grazing animal production, which is where the vast majority of stock containment areas will sit without any extra requirements needed. So the easy way to determine if you're a grazing animal production system is, do the animals have regular access to pasture? Is supplementary feeding conducted for specific purposes as part of the grazing production system? In general, can the property sustain regular grazing? If you've answered yes to all of these, then you're likely grazing production, and a stock containment area will fit within that with no or minimal requirements. And if you do need to include local government, for example, here in Victoria, we've got setbacks. So if the fixed feeding infrastructure, so that's any component associated with the stock containment area, the laneways, the pens, the bunks, any effluent management that needs to be in place. If that's 100 metres from a dwelling, so somebody else's house, of designated waterway as per the Water Act of 1989, so basically a blue line on a map, or residential zone or urban growth zones. So if you're on the edge of a town, if you can get that 100 metres away from it, then you're likely to not need a permit. If you can't, then you're definitely going to need a buildings and works permit. We do recommend, as you can see here, that we highly recommend producers consult with local government prior to constructing fixed feeding infrastructure. You're better off asking the question and then going, no, you don't need to talk to us, but at least you've asked the question early. Oops, sorry about that. So for producers in Victoria, there's an option here. For producers in other parts of Australia, I do apologise, I haven't found anything comparable to this. But in Victoria, we've got navigating farm developments, and this is for all industries. I've just picked beef for this example. The website's at the bottom there, development.agriculture.vic.gov.au. And what you can do here is you can put in your address. I've picked the Hamilton Research Fund. Once you start, you agree to the terms and conditions, You can read those. You start and you map out your property. Once you've done that, then you select your type of development. I've just screenshotted here the feedlot and containment area for the differences. They're quite wordy, but as you can see in the cattle feedlot, it refers to the cattle feedlot as by the code versus stock containment area, which are not defined by the code. They're defined as a stock containment area. Once you've done that, you draw your layer. As you can see here, we're in the PCRZ, which is Public Conservation and Resource Zone, because it's a research farm owned by the state. Slightly to the north, you can see the FZ, which is the farming zone. So they're the type of zones you'll get. Once you've mapped it out, sorry, apologies for that. This is just, again, a bit of an example of some of the zones you can find. So farming zone, rural activity, green wedge, so on and so forth. Section 1 basically means no permit is required, that task or that undertaking is permitted in that region, no worries. Section 2, most of the time, has no restrictions on it. Section 3, which is basically only the broiler farm type end of it in this stage, or the cattle feedlot, that's not permitted in any way, shape or form. The asterisks mean that it is permitted, but you quite often have a lot of requirements you need to meet to enable that to happen. Obviously, the cattle feedlots have the cattle code to stand by. So once you've done that, then we can go through our planning overlays and our measurements. You can measure out the distance to an adjoining dwelling, a waterway, and other urban growth zones or rural areas that are required. Because this is a stock containment area, it's very easy. If we went into a feedlot, there'd be a lot more overlays that we would need to measure out for. Then we go through a quick questionnaire. This is just a sample of it. Things like, do you intend to turn this into a feedlot in the future? If you tick yes to that box, it will recommend that you go back and do it as a feedlot rather than a stock containment area. Different components through here around installing shade or shelter. Will native vegetation need to be cleared? Will you require new access points? Do you have a current copy of the title, caveats and easements? Have you rung dial before you dig? And will any earthworks? Once you've gone through that, there is an explanation for each of them, so it makes it quite easy. You can add another development. So if you're doing multiple developments, you can add that, or you can just do the individual one and get to the summary. The summary then is able to be printed or PDF'd, which will actually go through, and as you can see here, give you a little bit of detail around what zones you're in, what planning schedules, the soil types, shires, and the bonus is with the shires here, all this in blue, so the different shires, the emails, they're all links to the actual documents on the Shire's website. So you can just click that link and go straight to the planning application form and start filling it out. There's a lot of information in this, and if you are planning on doing it, particularly in Victoria, I do recommend going to the Navigating Farm Development's website and going through the process. It will highlight to you where you need to go and what information you need to collect to gather up. And it's a handy document to have, even if you don't need to go to Shire. You can then say, look, I've been through this process, and based on that, I made the decision I don't need to go to the Shire because it is a stock containment area. Or if your neighbours go, oh, you've got a feedlot, you go, no, it's a stock containment area, here's the paperwork. And getting towards the end now, so a bit on detail on what we define emergency feeding. As you would imagine, it's basically feeding animals for biosecurity, fires, floods, any of the major natural disasters where they can't graze pasture. So under that, you can put them in a stock containment area for an extended period because they don't have access to pasture or foraging plants on the ground. Where it varies is for seasonal feeding. That can be part of droughts or just dry seasons. We've all experienced a few of those in the last few years. So this is where you can use it for a short period of time to go, right, we're going through to the autumn break. 2 weeks post the autumn break, we should have sufficient feed on the ground that we can let them out. That's the definition of seasonal feeding, or a definition of, there's variations obviously. But again, there's not the pasture or foraging plants around for them to eat. So it is better for them to be in a containment. And then supplementary feeding. So supplementary feeding is where you would bring, for an example, bring ewes in to maintain condition, or differentially feed based on scanning results. You may even be able to finish a few lambs of your own. Understanding though that if you do bring in lambs, particularly in Victoria, you'll find that as an intensive system and you will need a permit. So if you buy store lambs and you finish them on your place in a containment area, that will trigger an overlay for you and you will need an intensive permit. But if they're your own lambs and you're just finishing off the tail end, then it fits within the supplementary feeding. And it can be 100% of their feed for a discrete period. And what we mean by the discrete period is you have an end date. That might be 2 weeks post autumn break, as I mentioned, or it could be when we're going to feed up till Christmas because nobody wants to feed on Christmas. So having that discrete period is important, and that's why at the very start I said write out your stock containment area plan, because you do want to identify that period and how you intend to use it, because that will help you identify whether it is part of the stock containment area for a emergency seasonal supplementary feeding, or does it trigger an intensive permit for a feedlot. And that brings me to the end. I just want to remind everybody that we have Clem on next week talking about design and fit for purpose. Clem will go through a bit on water, pen size and shape and that sort of detail. So more of the actual how do you do it? How do you select a good site based on soil types and things like that? And then that's followed up by Nick on how do you actually manage it? How do you feed? And Nick will probably not like my previous photo of them feeding out in a containment area on the ground. That's probably not going to fit his risk management very well. So hopefully I've covered everything you wanted to get out of tonight. I'm happy to sit here and answer any questions I can. As I said, may have to take a few on notice, but yeah, fire away.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Chris. Some questions rolling in at the moment. And I can see you've got where to find some more information up on your screen now. So yeah, if anyone wants to further investigate this field, as Chris is saying, we do have 3 webinars in this series and 2 more. So instead of having a week off, we're squeezing 1 into next week and then 1 into the week after. Just to give Chris a bit of a break before we jump into questions, if you do have to head off early, as you close the webinar, you will be presented with a survey. If you could take 2 to 3 minutes to complete this survey, it provides feedback for MLA, the presenters like Chris and Agriculture Victoria, and the facilitators, myself, to make sure that we are giving you topics relevant to you as producers. And I will also note again that these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website. If you just Google MLA Productivity and Profitability Webinars, then you'll find them pretty easily. If not, just flick me an email and I can send you the link. Normally they're up by the end of the week. Okay, Chris, the first question, what is the recommended distance away from neighbours?
So the minimum is 100 metres from a dwelling in another ownership. That's government talk. So basically 100 metres is the short answer. That's the requirement. Obviously, the further you can get away, the less chance of upsetting your neighbours. And that's up to you whether you actually want to upset them or not. Typically, probably 500 metres would be where you'd be looking to be comfortable. You know, that's also the extent of what people can see generally. So there's, that's probably about where you want to be. Minimum of 100, about 500 if you can, obviously, depending on where you are and how big your place is, that will be restricting.
Great, thank you. The next question, what is the main difference in looks between a feedlot and a containment?
Absolutely nothing. you'll find out from Clem and Nick down the track that, particularly from Clem, we would recommend you actually build it to either the cattle feedlot code or I can't remember the exact name of it, intensive feeding of sheep document on the MLA website, I think it is. By building it to that level, you know that it's safe, it's secure, you've got sufficient water, sufficient bunk space or feeder space. So that would be our recommendation, is you build it to that level. Obviously, depending on how you intend to use it, you may be able to not necessarily cut corners, but reduce some of the infrastructure you require. You may not need full concrete pads and the exact drainage of a feedlot. You may be able to get away with a little bit less, but the way they should look should be the same. Well, the main difference is how you manage them. So that's why I recommend writing out the plan so that you understand whether you're planning to use it as a feedlot or you're planning to use it as a stock containment area. And then from there, whether you have any overlays that will trigger it to be an intensive system that requires a permit. So hopefully that helps.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the question. The next one, will the tool notify my council that I have proposed a development?
I can't guarantee that, but I don't believe so. It's housed and managed by Agriculture Victoria. While there are links to the Shire and you can email them direct, I'm not aware of it notifying the Shires in any way, shape or form. If you are concerned about that, feel free to send me an email or get in touch with Hillary and she can reach out to me and we can get a definite answer, but I don't believe so, no.
Yeah, absolutely. You would have seen my email come through on all the promotional materials. So yeah, please reach out. What is, and I assume that at least one of the 3 webinars will cover this if Chris can't answer it tonight, but what is the maximum number of sheep you can hold in a containment?
That's a very good question. It probably ultimately comes down to effluent management, so runoff and manure management. As far as I know, there's not a defined number for a stock containment area. Obviously, if you start getting into large numbers, managing the effluent will become a bit more of a priority and an issue, at which point you may trigger an EPA or another works planning permit. So I would suggest if you're thinking of a big one, sort of more than 3,000 or 4,000 head, it's probably worth again reaching out to either the third email website there, the Sustainable Animal Industries. That will make reference to the expert panel of animal industry panel, and they can step you through what requirements you might need and whether or not it's worth getting a consultant in if it's a big enough enterprise.
Great, thank you. There appears to be no more questions this evening. If you do have one, please shoot it through quickly. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up for this evening. Let's just see. Yeah, I just will also reiterate these webinars are recorded. So if you have anyone that missed tonight's presentation, just point them in the direction of the MLA website and they will be able to find it there, hopefully by the end of the week. No, that seems like all for this evening. So thank you very much, Chris and Agriculture Victoria, for part 1 of the Stock Containment Area webinar series. We'll be back obviously next week with part 2 and we'll see you then.
All right. Thanks, Hillary. Thank you, everybody.